Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a really exciting chat coming up where we're going to look at really how powerful the internet can be, particularly for groups such as LGBTQ. And joining me is Chris, who has been described as the man who changed the Olympics, but we'll come to that in a little bit. And obviously the internet has been a big part of your story. So tell us a little bit about growing up and your story and how you came to be here on this stage today.
Excellent. So my name is Chris Mosier. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I say that because you don't always know how someone might identify themselves. That was very much my experience growing up. I've always felt the same way about myself my entire life. And it was maybe in middle school, high school, that I started to recognize that there was a disconnection between the way that I saw myself and the way that other people saw me. I was assigned female at birth. I identify as a transgender man. And I grew up competing in girls' and women's sports and found in college that I didn't want to continue to pursue a career in sports because I didn't want to be on a women's team. But at that time, and just for context, it was 1998, graduated college in 2003, I didn't have access to a community. I didn't have the language or the understanding of the LGBTQ community. I didn't have real people in my life. And even living in New York City, I didn't know transgender people in real life. So it really wasn't until the internet, until I was on Facebook and on YouTube particularly, that I started to see people that I could see myself in. And so the internet for me was really influential and instrumental in me understanding my own identity as a transgender man.
And just thinking about taking us all back to school, and I know it's a bit of a scary thought, but how important is that sense of identity and that sense of community, particularly when you're growing up?
Oh, I think it's everything, right? Like, we know that being a young person is incredibly challenging with or without the internet. But having that sense of belonging is what we all strive for. So it was part of the reason that I was really drawn to sports, was that no matter how weird people thought I was off the court or off the field, that they valued me and loved me because I was a good athlete and a good teammate. And so, I really think that sense of community in the sports world is what got me through. And I was searching for that in terms of my identity. I was searching for queer people, and I identify as queer, I'm using it in a positive term. I was searching for queer people in the world that I could say, oh yeah, that's a shared experience. Because where I lived and how I grew up, I didn't have that around me. I wasn't seeing positive representations in the media, and I wasn't seeing that community in real life.
And what sort of challenges did you face? Obviously, you were doing something that you love, competing, but take us through how you got to that point where actually things changed. And they changed quite dramatically, didn't they, for you in terms of being allowed to compete?
Right. I became a triathlete in about 2008, 2009, and was competing in the women's category. And at that time, I understood my identity to be that of a transgender man, but I didn't know, and I was terrified, I was very afraid to come out and tell people. And this had been about 2 years of seeing other people's transitions on YouTube, seeing people on social media, and kind of doing that. One of the reasons I think the internet is so influential for LGBTQ people is that I was able to sort of be out without being out. I was able to have my identity, my real, authentic identity online without the fear and concern of how people around me would react. So I delayed my transition for over a year before I came out because I was terrified that I would lose my ability to compete in sport. In 2010, just the policies that were in place were bad, or there weren't policies at that time for some of the sports that I was playing. So I started to compete as male in 2010, and in 2015, I made Team USA and was the first transgender man to make a men's U.S. national team. Thank you.
Fantastic.
But at that time, the policy that was in place for the International Olympic Committee said that I was unable to compete at the world level. So I challenged the policy, which is how you got to that opening part. And the policy changed in 2016 to allow transgender athletes more access to compete at the world
I think that's the second round of applause.
Yeah, thank you.
pretty amazing, and I know we're going to talk a lot more about that. But a quote that I've read that you've said is, you are trying every day to be who you needed when you were younger.
Yes.
And you've talked about the internet being a powerful part of bringing that awareness to the forefront, really. So can you tell me a little bit about what sort of support you were able to get from the internet and how that helped?
I mean, think about this, right? It's only been 8 years since I transitioned, since I came out. And I understood my identity, let's say, 10 to 11 years ago, and there was this in-between time of not feeling like the world was a safe place for me to be my authentic self. The amount of change that we've seen in the last 8 years in terms of acceptance, in terms of positive representations in the media, in terms of in the sports world, having out professional athletes who are open about their identity, most of them after their playing careers, but still someone that we can look to and say, as a young athlete, I can say, it's okay for me to be gay and to continue to play the sport that I love and be both, right? And that I don't have to choose between my true identity and what I love to do. And so, this is part of the reason I say I want to be who I needed when I was younger, because I didn't see that person. I didn't see transgender men competing against men. And I didn't see out LGBTQ athletes in a way that made me go, oh yeah, I can do that too. So I think visibility is a really powerful tool for social change. And, online component of that has really just amplified the reach of my story to allow, young kids and parents of young kids and older athletes reconnect with sport, stay involved with sport, and know that they don't have to hide parts of themselves in order to do that.
Great. And have there been any particular examples that sort of stand out where, as a result of you telling your story online, you've seen within the comments or been messaged about how that's really helped that individual? There's been any cases that stand out?
Yeah, I think, every day I get messages from people, which is a really blessed and privileged position to be in. But, some of the standouts are professional sports players. Harrison Brown is a professional hockey player who just retired from the National Women's Hockey League. And he was the first transgender man to compete in a professional women's league. And he tells that part of his journey was seeing my story, seeing me in the ESPN body issues, seeing my Nike commercial, and saying, wow, this is an option for me to be authentic with my identity. But I also get messages like I got last night from a parent of a young transgender boy who wants to continue to play sport and just asking for advice. I think, the whole range of communication and the fact that people have access to me through Facebook, through Instagram, and can get their questions answered and see that possibility model.
Yeah,
it's very cool.
It's incredibly powerful. And thinking about the internet, we know that actually there's a lot of goods, but there's also a lot of bad. And when it comes to LGBTQ abuse, that can be pretty high. That sort of idea is something that's led you down a particular path when it comes to using technology to track that. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that and what you decided to do?
Yeah, so I should say that we've moved our community support for LGBTQ people in sports has moved from on the phone conference call style calls with young collegiate and high school athletes who were either out or not out. In 2015. By 2016, this organization, Go Athletes, folded when I left because leadership was no longer needed. The place where young LGBTQ people were meeting was online. And they found their community in secret Facebook groups and through Instagram, and those spaces were no longer necessary. But what we've seen is that the language in sport has not changed despite people feeling more connected in the community. So I work for an organization called You Can Play. You Can Play project online, and You Can Play is an organization that believes that all people should have access to sport, including LGBTQ people. So athletes should be judged on their skill, their work ethic, their competitive ability, and not on their sexual orientation or gender identity or any other determining factor. So it's really just if you can play, you can play. You Can Play works a lot with language.
Yeah.
And so we, in partnership with other organizations, help support the creation of a website called nohomophobes.com. It's nohomophobes.com. And it tracks in real time the number of times each day and over a week that 4 anti-LGBTQ slurs are said on Twitter. And so I can pull this up in a presentation. You can see in real time the actual tweets that are happening from around the world that use the language of so gay, faggot, dyke, and no homo. And it's amazing for me to start a presentation, to watch the numbers go up by the hundreds by the time I finish, or to check in later at the end of the day and see the numbers in the thousands, and to see the way that people are actually using this language online, in a hidden, anonymous sort of way. That a lot of the times it is casual homophobia. It means nothing. It's, in the way that people say that's so gay, that they are really meaning something else, but it's become a part of sports culture, a part of the society that we live in. And also, the other part is very targeted attacks on the LGBTQ community. So you see both examples of the way that the language is used online, and it's a very visible tool to track that since 2013, 2014, when the website has been up.
Yeah, and I think that those sort of examples just show how powerful language is, because I can remember myself being in the classroom and hearing people around me using those sort of terms. And for me growing up and trying to understand my sexuality, that was incredibly damaging, because I was hearing all around me that it was a bad thing to be gay and to be LGBT. So it's a useful reminder that we've still got a lot to work to do, not just offline, but online as well when it comes to the use of language. Which I suppose brings me to technology and thinking about apps like Grindr and Her and Tinder. Obviously, they've had a big impact on the LGBTQ community. What's your kind of opinion on how much of an impact and whether that's been positive?
They have the same impact on the straight community too, right?
Yeah.
It is the way that people meet each other, the way that people hook up, and I think that it was interesting to see. And maybe this really was the intention of an app like Grindr initially, was for hookups, but that was very much the impression that I got as a person outside of using it, because I was already in a relationship, and thankfully I didn't have to do the online dating thing, but just for my own sanity, I don't think I could handle it. But so the impression that I got was that it was boiled down to sex. And it's one of the stereotypes that people have about the LGBTQ community, that our relationships are only about sex. And it's a myth and misconception. I think that it dismisses the validity of our relationships. And I think apps like that, like Grindr and other apps for the LGBTQ community, are as important as the online dating apps for the straight community.
Yeah, totally agree. And in terms of this idea of technology and the need for diversity, I know your organization obviously thinks a lot about that, and just how important is it that within some of these startup companies and these tech companies, there is diversity when they're serving populations bigger than some countries?
I mean, I think that intersectionality needs to be thought of at all levels, right? It's the makeup of your company and your board, it's the population that you're serving. I can't separate my identity from who I am. I live it every day, and so when there's a gender marker on an app that I have to fill out, I'm looking for those clues to see if a company, if an organization, if an app is inclusive. Because are there only 2 options? How are we leaving our gender expansive, non-binary, gender fluid, or transgender users? Right? Is this a safe place for me to be? Is it thinking about my needs? I live that every day, and so I think it's really important for us to understand that I can only share my experience, as a study of one, right? I am a white transgender man, which is very different than the experience of transgender women. It's very different than the experiences of a trans person of color, and similar but very different to other members of the LGBTQ community. And so I think that we need to understand that it's all of these different factors. You can't isolate them. They all play into how someone interacts with your product and how your team, your folks working in your office, are going to interact to achieve your end goal. And so I think we're at a space where we have to be thinking about inclusion and not tolerance, and not just understanding, but really embracing and accepting and bringing people in to achieve those greater goals.
And talking of goals, what is next? That for some people, and I suppose the internet has really helped create awareness of that. We've come a long way when it comes to human rights and this area. But we shouldn't forget that in 72 countries, it's still against the law to be in a same-sex relationship. And in 8 of those countries, I think it's the death penalty. So what should we be focusing on next, and what role should technology have in really furthering that success that we've had so far?
It is literally a matter of life and death. And I know that sounds very serious, but the way that this works in our world where young people particularly are interacting so much with technology, we have these cases like Tyler Clementi, who was a student at Rutgers in New Jersey in 2010, whose roommates set up a webcam and live streamed his encounter with another man. And the next day or that night, he jumped off the George Washington Bridge to his death. It really is a matter of life and death for young people whose identities are questioned, who are unsure of their place in this world, particularly in the political environment that we are living in the United States. And I think that we have a responsibility to understand that as diverse as folks are within male or female, as many different ways as there are to be a man or a woman, as many different ways there are to have a relationship between a man and a woman, there are that many ways and more to express one's gender as a trans person, as a gender expansive person, or as a gay, lesbian, bisexual, or queer person. And so we have to understand that it's a diverse community, and we need to be thinking about all of our users, all of the folks in our offices, and our investors, and everyone who, in this global society, it's important not to stereotype us down to one thing.
Really important advice. And just to sort of end us on some real practical advice, if some of us, you talked about workplaces, but if we're seeing this sort of derogatory language, hate, I suppose, if we're seeing that in our workplaces or online or in the street, what should we try and do? And how should we challenge it, and why is it so important?
I mean, I think simply put, silence is acceptance. And you are who you are when no one's looking. So whether you stand up to someone on the street who you don't know, who's saying anti-LGBTQ things, or a friend or family member in your close circle, I think it's really important for us to live by our values. And we need to express those values because people buy on values as well. We need to express that fully through everything that we do. I think a great thing would be to check out your organization, because I think you'd be better suited to answer this question. Do you want to close it out with some tips for folks?
Totally. We run a program which just spread to the USA, which is about empowering young people to stand up to all forms of abuse and bullying. But yeah, let's end actually. If people are after a little bit more information about your organization and your story, where can they go?
Absolutely. So you can playproject.org, The Chris Mosier on social media, and thechrismosier.com for my personal story. And thank you so much for being here.
Great. Well, I've really enjoyed chatting to you, Chris.
Thanks
and
so much.
I know there's lots more we could have talked about, but it's great that we've got those links. But big thank you to Chris. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.